Okay, so thanks for coming. So today, hopefully I'll be able to convince you about why kelps are way cool. Kelps live along some of the most striking landscapes that you might find along your drives along the coast, including here in British Columbia. We have a number of different kelps. This is one of the most diverse areas for seaweeds that are anywhere in the world along the Northeast Pacific coast. So when you look at this picture, when you're driving, maybe not the driver, but the passengers, you can see the darkening in the water, and everything that's a darkening like that is generally a kelp. They are the major structure, massive forming species that are photosynthetic, both along our coastlines and then on the rocks on the shoreline as well. So they can be found both in intertidal and subtidal habitats. This is a picture of a subtidal kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera, the giant kelp, and they are found along the continental shelf in the euphotic zone. So the euphotic zone is where light reaches. And kelps that live here are constantly underwater, except for the canopies, which if they reach the surface, then they're exposed to the air at the surface of the ocean. In contrast, in the intertidal, like you see here, this is actually at Botanical Beach. This is on Vancouver Island. So close to home here. They are exposed to low tides during the spring tides, so that is when the tides are really low during the full and the new moon. Organisms living in these environments are particularly amazing because they must thrive in oceanic conditions, which they're oceanic organisms, but they also have to be able to withstand terrestrial conditions like sun, rain, and snow. So this brown seaweed that you see here, kind of dominating the intertidal, that is all a kelp called Saccharina sessilis. Now imagine that you are trying to live in this environment right here. So this is what a lot of kelps experience at some point in their, within the year, especially in the wintertime. But if you're an intertidal organism, you're definitely seeing this all the time. And if you look on that center rock, there are a couple of kelps that are being smashed by the waves, and they're the ones that are kind of extending and dripping off the left-hand side of that rock. That is Menziesii, and it's one of these pressings that's up here. It inhabits mostly this really wave-intense zone called the surf zone. So let's talk about what a kelp is and what makes them so special. So this is the giant kelp, like I've already told you. This is Macrocystis pyrifera, and it is the dominant structure-forming kelp that is found worldwide. So kelps are eukaryotes, and if you look at this little green line, that phaeophyta is where brown algae, brown seaweed are found. And you can see that they're in this section called heteroconts, which I have written in there. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those. But if you look in the purple section, there is a tiny little branch called animals. So to put it in perspective, we're over in that lower right-hand corner. The brown algae that we're talking about is in this heterocont section. And then on the top is plantae, where the land plants are along with green algae and red algae. So these are slightly different than other seaweeds found in the ocean. So heterocont, what that means is that their motile stages are biflagellate. And biflagellate means there's two swimming structures. And so in a heterocont, each of them is differently shaped. So in the top figure there, you'll see on the left the two antenna-looking things. Those are actually the swimming structures. The one on the left, those are actually shaped exactly the same. So that is not a heterocont. The one on the right has only one swimming structure, so that's not a heterocont, but the one in the middle is. You can see that there are those little hairs coming off the one swimming flagella in the green box, and on the other flagella, there actually isn't anything coming off of it. So they're biflagellated and they're differently shaped. Brown seaweeds, brown algae, are in the class Phaeophyceae, and there are between 15 and 2,000 species worldwide, including 13 different orders, 12 of which, just to highlight how diverse our coast is, are found along the Northeast Pacific coast, like here in British Columbia. And this includes, one of these orders is Laminariaceae, which is the scientific name for kelps. So here is a drawing of the morphology of a kelp. This is, again, the giant kelp macrocystis. The holdfast, or the attachment spot, is found at the very bottom. You can see this. It looks like roots, but they're actually different than roots because they don't draw up any nutrients. So that is one distinguishing factor between how plants use their attachment spot and how algae uses their attachment spot. Then moving along, you can see there is a dichotomy, or this separation, and those form two stipes. So this internal branch that runs all the way to the top is called a stipe, and then blades are found dispersed along the entirety of the plant. The base of each blade connecting it to the stipe, there is a float or a pneumaticist, and that is what actually keeps the plant upright in the water column. So these floats are filled with carbon monoxide, and if the plant has a float, then that means it will extend up towards the surface of the water. If it doesn't have a float, that means that it will lie prostrate or flat against the substrate. And then once you get to the top, you'll see that if the plant reaches the top, then that is the canopy, where it is actually at the surface and starts to kind of bend and fold with the current flow. The reproductive material is found on these little tiny blades that are at the bottom of the plant. It says sporophyll. I know it's hard to read, but those are specialized reproductive stressors that contain the spores that will then be released to form the next generation of individuals. There are three families in kelps: Laminariaceae, Laminariaceae, and Lawsoniaceae, and there are around 30 genera in these true families. Examples of these are, in Laminariaceae, are Alaria marginata, which is on the left here. This is an intertidal kelp. You can find it along our outer coasts. On the right, this is Pterygophora californica. We have this in our subtidal environments as well. It is the subcanopy species, or if you think about it, we have the big bull kelp that forms the canopies on our coasts, and then like if you think about the bushes in a forest, these are like the bushes in a forest. This is the understory canopy forming species. In Laminariaceae, a couple of examples are, again, Agresia, the feather boa kelp. We talked about that one already. And then on the right is Laminaria. This is an intertidal, low intertidal kelp as well. And then the last true family is Lawsoniaceae. This is where the megakelps are found, the giant kelp on the left, and then the bull kelp on the right. So macrocystis on the left and Nereocystis on the right. Kelps have a heteromorphic diplohaplontic life history, and what heteromorphic means is two different shapes, and diplohaplontic means that they have a diploid stage and a haploid stage. So that's two different looking stages in their life history. And what that looks like is, if you again think about macrocystis here on the left, this is the adult plant that you see in the subtidal area. From the sporophylls, which are these little blades just right above the holdfast at the bottom of the adult plant, are released these free-swimming zoospores, which is the stage that you see at the very top of the diagram. These zoospores have to swim in the water and then find the substrate, and then they settle on the substrate, and those little spores turn into the males and females. The males and females then develop their reproductive material. There are eggs on the female, as you see on the top right, The round structure is a depiction of an egg, and then the males develop sperm. And when the females are ready to reproduce, they produce a pheromone called lamozyrine, which then induces the males to release their sperm, and they're attracted to the pheromone lamozyrine. So this is all happening microscopically in the rocks along the substrate. The female egg is then fertilized, and the microscopic sporophyte you see here on the bottom in the drawing, which then will grow and turn into this giant macroscopic plant that we generally think of as what a kelp is. But there are two distinct phases that can be found at any given time throughout the year.
So, question, sorry. Can you just back up one there, please? So your zoospores up top, are they I don't want to, well, I do. I want to say male and female at that point?
Yes. Yes, they are.
Oh, okay.
And these are the biflagellate. This is what makes them heteroconts.
Right.
So they're 50 about percentage of males and females.
Okay, so even at that stage, they're already
Yes.
distinguished as two different sexes.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And so now I'm going to show you what all of these different microscopic stages, we know what the macroscopic stage looks like. I'll show you what the microscopic stages look like under the microscope. So, firstly, on the top left is a settled zoospore. So this is once the free-swimming zoospores have found the substrate, they settle, and we know that they have settled because they become spherical. So when they're spherical like this, they have attached to the substrate. So that's on the top left. They then germinate, which means they're starting to grow. That's on the top right. And basically, we know that they're germinated because they look like inverted bowling pins. They kind of have a thinner structure on the bottom where the attachment point is, and it bows out like a bowling pin on the top, which is what you see the more bulby part looking. On the bottom left and right are the males and females. So you can see the egg on the bottom right is the female. And then these kind of filamentous structures that the arrow is pointing to are the males. In the center, the arrow is pointing to the sporophyte. So this female egg has been fertilized, and now it's going to grow to the macroscopic size. This is all at 400 times magnification. So this spore, for example, this settled zoospore, is about 5 micrometers big. It's really, really tiny.
So you're saying that the male is attracted to the pheromones of the female and actually fertilizes the female?
Yeah, the sperm does, yeah. From the male.
Okay.
And so each of those sporophytes will grow into a kelp. And those little tiny microscopic sporophytes, they all start looking the same way. And then they'll all grow into something that looks like any given one of these different types of kelp. So they can be intertidal or subtidal, but they all start out looking extremely similar, just a little blade with a little attachment point. Even when you start to be able to see them with the naked eye, they'll still look all similar no matter which kelp it is. Now, kelps can reach 80 meters in height, and they dominate they're the structure-forming species that dominate both intertidally and subtidally. So here again is an example of the intertidal structure-forming species. This is again Saccharina sessilis, and you can see just takes up all of the canopy space all in the intertidal for a pretty substantial portion. If you think about the space that the tide comes in and out, this is a pretty substantial portion of the intertidal zone. Not very many other species can compete with forming canopies like kelps can. The one that lives in conjunction with kelps here is the seagrass Phyllospatix, which is this green-looking grass that is growing at the bottom of this picture. And then, again, they are the canopy-forming dominants in the subtidal zone. And this includes both Macrocystis and Nereocystis, along with a couple of other species. But those are the two major ones that are found along in the Northeast Pacific, where we would be familiar with looking. Another amazing thing about kelps is that they're found worldwide in polar to subtropical regions. So an example of the extension of some of the different kelp species are, you can see where we are in Vancouver, up there on the top left. We have both Macrocystis and Nereocystis, and those extend all the way from Alaska down to Baja California. This is the same species, so if you think about something that's attached that can't move, but it can withstand freezing temperatures all the way to like Mexico temperatures, it's pretty striking and amazing that one species can do that. Macrocystis also lives in the southern hemisphere, along with Lawsonia, which is a lower intertidal species. And you can also see the different places that Macrocystis has inhabited in the southern hemisphere as well. So along the southern coast of Africa and along the southern coast of Australia. They also have diverse growth strategies, and so I'm going to tell you about some of those. They can be both annual or perennial. So kelps can either reproduce and die off within a 1-year cycle, or they can live all year long, depending on which species they are. They can have continuous or seasonal reproduction, so some kelps continuously reproduce all year long, and some of them are cued by certain environmental factors like a certain amount of blue light or a certain time of year, or when temperatures reach a certain level. So these are all different ways that they are induced to start producing their reproductive material. Kelps have dormant and non-dormant microscopic stages. So when we talk about the little tiny males and females that are living on the rocks that you can't see with the naked eye, those can overwinter, like if you think of a bulb in a tulip. The bulbs overwinter, and kelps can do the same thing. So they'll just wait and wait and wait and wait till they get to the right temperature, or until they get to the right amount of blue light that they need to cue to start reproducing to move to the macroscopic stage.
Do they know how long any of those can remain dormant? Like 1 year, 10 years? Is there any indication of?
You know, I know they overwinter, but I don't know how many years they can overwinter for. These environmental cues can be extremely rigid, like the day length has to be 14 hours before it can start reproducing, or they can be semi-flexible, and that's usually with something like temperature. They can grow and reproduce vegetatively. So some kelps can only rely on reproduction to start a new plant, but some other kelps are more like strawberries. If you think of how strawberries pull their rhizome out and then they'll just shoot up another plant, some kelps do the same type of thing. So they can just kind of crawl along to take up space. They are extremely highly variable in morphology. And this is important when you're living in an area such as the surf zone and you need to change your morphology in order to withstand drag or other types of environmental factors that could otherwise maybe pull you off of the rock if you become too big or too bulky or too fat instead of being thin and streamlined. Again, they can grow vertically in the water, so this would be with floats, or they can grow prostrate, meaning they won't have a float and they'll just kind of lie wherever the current takes them. And they can grow really, really quickly. They can grow up to possibly 1 meter per day. This is a really productive type of organism. And if you think about that, that would be like watching your grass grow from the ground like all the way up to your waist in a day. And they are distributed mainly, kelps, in this lower intertidal area. So when you walk out on the rocks, it has to be pretty low tide to be able to see any type of kelp. And they are depicted down at the bottom of the drawing down here. So these little things poking out of the water are supposed to be Laminaria, and then these other blades are different kelp species that are kind of hanging off the rock. So lower intertidal species usually. In the subtidal zone, they are generally quite dominant. So you can see that as you move to the greater depths, there are a number of different species that inhabit the shallow to the deep depths. So this depth gradient is set up where it can be a competitive thing. So certain kelps are in given areas because they are a better competitor, and so they outcompete other species that would like to live in that area. That's usually in these mid-depths where Macrocystis and Nereocystis live. They are really good competitors for space. In the shallower depths, those are usually set by physiological tolerance. And so kelps that can withstand higher temperatures, higher UV, and exposure to air, they are usually found higher in the subtidal. And then anything understory would be shade-tolerant species, so anything that can live under canopy kelps. So it's very similar to how, when you think about a forest, how that is set up as well. The same types of structuring components are similar, except for it's in this water medium. So now that we've seen the pictures and the drawings, what's it really like underwater in a kelp forest? So how I like to describe this to people is if you're thinking about standing in a forest, take Pacific Spirit Park for example, And you just think about the trees and the bushes and the grass and everything. And if you just picture all of that underwater, that's exactly how a kelp forest is. So a kelp forest has these big tree-like structures, which are the canopy-forming species like macrocystis. They have understory species as well. And they also have little turf algae that form like grass-like component, just like a forest does. These layers are depicted pretty well in this picture. So the giant kelp here, again, the big trees. On the front left corner, this is what looks like an understory pterogophora, and you can see the kelps, like little bushes, kind of all in the interspersed within the bigger plants. And the organisms live at all these different levels, just like in a forest. So in the canopy, there's canopy species that are specific to there. They are found along the canopy, like you see the little fish that are living kind of mid-plant there in the background. There's understory species that live kind of chilling on the rocks, like lingcod and stuff like that. And then there's species that live specifically on the substrate, so anything that's attached, anything that crawls around and stuff like that. And there are species that are very specific to each of those different levels, even within something like rockfish. Certain species of rockfish will be at the canopy. They'll always live in the canopy. Certain species will always be mid-canopy. Certain species will always be at the bottom. And so it's very well delineated where all of these species will be in general. And so kelp forests support very diverse multi-trophic communities. There's fishes, there's invertebrates, there's seaweeds besides kelps, and there's also large predators. So this is what a trophic diagram looks like. This shows the kelp in the bottom left. They are the first level, the first trophic level, and they support all of these other different types of animals that are living in there that either feed directly on them or rely on them for structure. And they also have house a number of different really commercially important species. Kelps are a commercially important species, other seaweed that's found in kelp forests, and also sea urchins, abalone, a number of different fishes, crabs, scallops, octopuses, and then some people like to eat sharks. So there are alternate stable states that can happen if the grazers that graze on kelps aren't kept in check. And the sea otters, our job is to eat these grazers and keep them at a level, this is what they generally do, to keep them from mowing down kelp forests. So that is what is depicted here in this picture. Sea otters actually regulate this from happening. So the diagram on the left is again the one that we already talked about, being the trophic structure of a kelp forest community that is inhabited by sea otters. So they regulate the number of grazers that graze on kelp species. Whereas the depiction on the right is the type of diversity in a community found in these urchin barrens. So you can see that they have eaten all of the seaweed. There's a number of other individuals that are no longer there, normally because they are actually associated with kelps. They're there for food and structure. And so there's a plethora of sea urchins and other sea stars, but there is a decrease in diversity in these types of communities as compared to kelp forest communities. And this loss is generally triggered by temperature and therefore current structure. So temperature changes, increases in temperature, decreases in temperature can also change current structure. And what this does is it actually changes the amount of nutrients that are coming to macrocystis, this giant kelp that we see here and the one in the video. And macrocystis, or kelps in general, are very sensitive to temperature increases. This is physiologically, they're sensitive to them, but also there is usually a loss in nutrients associated with temperature increases. However, sea urchins' metabolism speed up with increasing temperature. So they are like rip-roaring ready to keep eating with increases in temperature. So it's kind of a double whammy for kelps when temperature increases. They lose nutrients, it's harder for them to grow, their tissue starts to degrade, and then grazers start eating them at a much higher rate. So warming can cause community transitions from kelp forests to urchin barrens with a concurrent loss in species diversity. And there has been a project along our coast here that is done by researchers at UBC looking at differences in diversity in communities that are found with and without sea otters. So in the 1800s, sea otters were hunted from this area for their pelts. So they were not here for a couple hundred years, and they have slowly been reintroduced over time from populations in Alaska, moving them down along the BC coast. And they have reached about halfway down Vancouver Island. And this is an annual progression. So at the top of Vancouver Island, they have been situated there for longer, about 20 years. In the center of the island, they've been there for about 5 years. And on the southern end of the island, they have been there. They are still not inhabiting the southern end of the island. And so what we can do with this type of knowledge is we can see how communities have changed over 20 years, over 5 years, and then how they are now without any sea otters present. And look at differences in diversity among these communities, and also look at differences in fisheries. So this project also interviews the First Nations people that are associated with the communities found along these coasts and asks them about if they remember traditionally what they were fishing, what they're fishing now that the sea otters have been reintroduced, and how they economically are faring with this change in community structure. So it's kind of like a whole ecosystem study. And there, again, are quite a few really important commercial species that are found in kelp forests. Kelps specifically, abalone are a fishery that gets a lot of money, crab as well, large fishes, and then sea urchins are also used for food. So you might be thinking, well, kelp is a fishery, that's kind of weird. Like these things that we see that are all slimy in the intertidal or, washed up on shore. But it's true. People farm them, they collect them. These boats will go out and chop off the tops of plants and take all of this material in. They are a sustainable fishery that can be harvested. These men here are harvesting kelp in Asia, and this is in Chile. They're hauling in massive amounts of Lawsonia, the intertidal kelp, into these tiny boats. And then they put them on trucks and haul them away. They can be farmed on lines, so you can actually seed little baby kelps onto lines and string them out in the water, and then pull them up when they've grown, and then take them all off and do it all over again. And this is used for human consumption, for other types of products, and also to feed other fishery species such as abalone. Once they're taken off the lines, they're dried on racks like this for storage purposes. And kelps are also thought of to be a possible use for biofuel. So this graph is the increase in the amount of biofuel used. Because they are such highly productive organisms, they grow up to a meteor a day, and you can cut off a lot of their biomass and they'll regrow. They're trying to make these big farms where they might be able to yield enough kelp to produce ethanol. And the good thing about this is that it does not require irrigation, and it's not already a major food crop like corn is. It's also directly consumed in seaweed salad or soups or used for broths or flavorings. And it's packaged. You can buy it like in specialty stores, just in a regular package, and kombu is one of the most popular. It's Saccharina japonica, and it's used for flavor, garnish as a vegetable and a snack. Traditionally, kelps were burned and turned into soap, so you can use the ash to produce soap. And they are also have high iodine content, so it's used to treat goiter. And then they are also high in a structure called alginate, which is a polysaccharide found in their cell walls. Now, this is found in a number of different things that you might not expect. So it's used in waterproofing and fireproofing fabrics. It's in impression making for dentistry and prosthetics. It binds oily and watery liquids together, for example, salad dressings. It can change liquids into gels, so it helps shaving cream keep its shape, and it keeps lipstick texture smooth and flow easily. It's used as a thickening agent for drinks, ice cream, toothpaste, soups, jellies, salad dressings, and paint. And it's used in manufacturing for pharmaceuticals, building materials, livestock and poultry feed, fertilizers, and in beer. Kelp forests serve a number of different ecosystem services. These are resources and processes supplied by natural systems. Kelp support diverse communities which produce commercially important species, and they provide habitat which stabilizes our coastlines. They influence oceanographic patterns. They are destinations for recreation and tourism, and they are also a carbon and nutrient sink. So all of these are services that kelp forests are providing that we don't assign a monetary value to. They just do it automatically. So now thinking about kelp forests as a carbon and nutrient sink, this makes a nice transition to thinking about how kelps will be affected by climate change. And so I'm just going to tell you really briefly about one of the projects in my PhD. I'm interested in how climate change affects kelp. And so firstly, it's important to know that the ocean is a sink for carbon in our atmosphere. So any type of carbon emissions are directly absorbed into our oceans. And so the red line there shows the atmospheric CO2 increases over time from 1950 to the year 2010. And the blue line directly underneath it with the squiggles is the oceanic carbon concentration. So you can see that it directly mirrors the atmospheric concentration. And then the light blue line at the bottom that shows decreasing is that pH is decreasing in our oceans, or that our oceans are becoming more acidic. And so this increase in carbon and decrease in pH, this is what people call ocean acidification. Concurrently, we expect there to be global temperatures, average temperatures to increase. And what you see on the bottom picture is by the end of the century, we expect it to be a lot warmer. And so if we combine thinking of carbon concentrations going up and water temperatures going up, what will this do to organisms living in the ocean? There are a number of different factors that are also interplaying along with temperature and CO2, and they can cause changes in storm frequency, changes in upwelling, changes in water temperature, sea level rise, and UV. So all of these things we expect to be happening at the same time. And so if we are expecting all of these climate stressors to interact and affect our organisms, what will happen? Well, there are some broad-scale impacts that we already have researched. We have noticed changes in population dynamics or loss of structure forming species, which is detrimental to their associated community. And because kelps are integral species in the nearshore environments, we don't know what cascading community consequences might also happen to other organisms that rely on and are associated with the community. There are also physiological impacts. So kelps are sensitive to temperature increases, and generally increasing temperature is negative for kelp performance. So far to date, they show no effects or neutral effects of increases in carbon concentration, but there have not been specific research looking at the decrease in pH on its own. And then UV in general is negative for growth and reproduction of photosynthetic organisms. So let's say you're this green blob plant living right here in the intertidal. What's that going to mean if you are experiencing terrestrial and oceanic stressors that are going to be changing with climate change? So my PhD is looking at all of the different reproductive life history stages of kelp, and trying to target how increasing temperature, CO2, and UV will affect these different stages and where we might expect the changes in population dynamics to occur. So which stage is particularly sensitive. And so I'm going to show you just a little bit about this free-swimming zoospore stage. All these little white little blobs are kelp zoospores. So they are swimming around in the water. And what I am looking at is if these different swimming styles or speeds or turning radius changes depending on what water temperature they're at, what carbon concentration the water's at, and how high the UV levels are. So again, these are just about 5 micrometers wide. They're real tiny little guys. Okay, so this paper was done in conjunction with my advisors here at UBC and also researchers at UCLA in California. And what I found with these different temperatures and CO2 levels is that increasing temperature and CO2 causes decreasing swimming speed. Now you might be thinking, well, you know, 0.5 millimeters per second isn't that great of a difference in swimming speed, but if you're 5 micrometers, that's a pretty big drop in your swimming speed from just being at your ambient normal temperatures of 15 degrees down to when you increase temperature 6 degrees, which is the highest that we might expect water temperatures to increase by the end of the century. So this is what we might expect swimming speeds to be like for kelps at the end of the century. And again, for increases in CO2 that you see on the right, swimming speeds decrease with increasing CO2. And one of the other things is that it causes kelp zoospores to not be able to swim anymore. So this 0 line that you see, if the bar is above it, what that means is that there are more motile than non-motile spores. So kelps are actually swimming when the bar is above 0. When it's below 0, that means there are more non-motile spores. So spores actually aren't swimming at all. They're just sinking in the water. And so at 21 degrees C, there are more non-motile than motile spores. So they're actually not swimming at all. And the same thing is happening on the right at higher CO2, higher temperature levels. There are way more non-motile spores than motile spores. So they're not able to swim at higher temperature, higher CO2 concentrations. So why is this important? Again, let's think about where these kelps are trying to live. They're trying to live and settle in this environment. So if you're slower or you're not able to swim at all, you might not actually be able to attach to the substrate, which would be a problem. You'd be washed away in this environment. So hopefully by now you'll have a better understanding of how cool kelps and kelp forest communities are. They support a diversity of species, and they are found worldwide. And maybe when you're walking along our coastlines, you'll be able to identify these integral species. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, this is my research helper, Jasper. He's the guard dog of the intertidal. I'd be happy to take any questions.